Let's take a look at the second argument that Rachel offers up in favor of moral skepticism. He calls this argument the provability argument. And this argument goes as follows. If there were any such thing as an objective truth in ethics, we should be able to prove that some moral opinions are true and that others are false. Now, the idea here is that if there are truths that we can know, we should be able to come up with good reasons for why it is that a particular truth is in fact true. We should be able to know those truths or fail to know those truths. Second premise, if in fact we cannot prove which moral opinions are true and which are false. So if we can't prove those things, then we have this basic contradiction between what ought to be true if there are moral truths and what we in fact observe in our ability to demonstrate the truth or falsity of our moral opinions. Finally, conclusion, therefore there is no such thing as objective truth in ethics. So the idea is, if there is objective truth that can be known, if properties are really existent moral and ethical properties, then there ought to be a way to know them. There ought to be a way to prove that the properties exist or that a statement about them is true or false. If there isn't, then we have reasons to suppose that there are no truths. Rachels is going to criticize this argument by adopting that first strategy. He's going to argue that the provability argument is in fact unsound. And the strategy for doing this is to look at that second premise, right, and argue that that second premise probably isn't true, that we have good reasons to suppose that second premise is false. And if the premise is false, then the argument doesn't provide us with good reasons to suppose the conclusion is true. So how's he going to do that? Well, he's going to bring up two specific considerations that seem to undermine the truth of that second premise. So even if we find it intuitively appealing, or even if we believe it before we think about the argument, Rachels is going to give us reasons to question the truth of that premise and therefore to question whether or not the argument provides us with good reasons for adopting a moral skeptical position. So the first set of considerations is looking a little bit more carefully at this idea that there is no, in practice, consensus about moral questions, that there isn't the case that we can prove some things and disprove other things in the ethical sphere. So what he wants to suggest is that, look, when we think about complex or uncommon moral problems, things that don't occur very often in everyday experience, or that are extremely complex and nuanced moral problems, then it seems plausible that there's not agreement about them. It seems plausible that we don't have a way to prove one position is true and another position is false. But what Rachel suggests is that many moral opinions are in fact easily proven or disproven. So if you see someone stealing candy from a baby, right, that seems like really good evidence for the belief that that person is a morally bad person. That seems provable, demonstrable. And so that would contradict the truth of that second premise. And it gives us a number of different examples of cases like that. Right? He says a lot of judgments that we make about the ethical praiseworthiness or blameworthiness of particular moral actions or beliefs or principles are in fact pretty straightforwardly and easily proven or disproven. There's consensus about those issues. The second consideration that he brings up is that a mere lack of consensus at any particular point in time, a mere failure to know some truth at some point in time, doesn't actually give us extremely good reasons for the view that there is no truth to be known. And this is how this argument works. This argument claims, look, we haven't proven it, so there's nothing to prove, there's no way to prove it. And so this argument probably commits what philosophers sometimes call the fallacy of appeal to ignorance. It argues from a current state of ignorance or lack of knowledge to an in-principle state, argument or a conclusion rather, that the thing cannot be known ever in principle. It's not possible to know the truth because we don't know it now. The problem with appeals to ignorance is that they suppose that we've exhausted every possible avenue of investigation, that there is no new facts that could be learned, no new methods, no new arguments that could bear on this problem. And sometimes that's true, but oftentimes that's not true. And so when we see a lack of consensus about a particular issue, that doesn't give us good reasons to suppose that there's no fact of the matter, there's no solution. Right? So we can think of cases in the past where there hasn't been a strong consensus about the nature of the solution to a particular problem, or whether or not some particular belief was true. And that could be just simply because we didn't have the tools, the methodology, the knowledge, the perspective to investigate that. So there was a time, right, when we couldn't know what the back of the moon looks like. The moon doesn't rotate around its axis in the way that the Earth does, so one side is always facing us and we never see the other side. That doesn't mean that we can never, in principle, know what the other side of the moon looks like. And we, in fact, discovered what the other side of the moon looked like when we sent out satellites that orbited the moon and took pictures of that other side. So just because we don't know something, just because there isn't currently consensus about the answer to a question, that doesn't mean that there is no way to know it, that there is no consensus to be had. And this, again, undermines the plausibility of that second premise. So Rachel then wants to conclude that the provability argument is unsound. It has what looks like a false premise. And because it has a false premise, it doesn't matter if it's valid or not. It doesn't matter if the other premises are true. A valid deductive argument also has to have all true premises in order to be successful, in order to give us good reasons to adopt the conclusion. And since this argument seems to have a likely false premise, it doesn't give us good reasons to adopt that moral skeptical conclusion that the argument has. So in this consideration of this view of moral skepticism and the two arguments that are offered for it and the criticisms that Rachel gives of those arguments, he demonstrates in a practical way how argumentation works to help us to give reasons for particular views and evaluate those reasons, and to come to accept or reject a view on the basis of those reasons. And this is how constructive moral debate should be carried on in his view, and it's how arguments play this crucial role of mediating our discussions and interactions about moral issues.